It's time to put disc brakes on the front. I have the master cylinder replaced with a brake booster, so I now have power brakes. Part of that transition involves a new brake pedal because the mount point becomes different. That required cutting through the firewall and a few other things. Frankly, that project was much more involved, more difficult than I wanted it to be, but not terrible. The brake cylinder has been bled at the bench. The rest of the system is not bled. So basically, I've effectively got no brakes at this point. I do have a proportioning valve on there, which you need to have, especially with discs in the front and drums in the back. But it also makes things so that I could pretty well turn off the back brakes, right? Set the proportioning valve so that the braking power is as much as possible to the front, and that facilitates a pretty good brake stance. Don't tell my kids that. Anyway, today the goal is to pull this wheel off, remove the drum brakes and the entire brake mechanism. That will reveal the spindle. I have a Wilwood disc brake conversion kit to put on, and it's actually not too bad. I read through the instructions the first time, and it was kind of overwhelming because it talks about needing a qualified machinist and all these kinds of things. And the reality is it's not that bad, in part because I have drum brakes. If you have disc brakes and you try to put this kit on, it's a more involved project. It's still doable, but more involved. It requires some drills and taps and countersink bits. This one, however, is pretty straightforward. Let's get started. Step one, we'll pull this wheel. And just set it aside. The drum is held on by a nut on the spindle behind this cap. So we need to first pry that off with our screwdriver. By the way, the Wilwood kit comes with a new cap. That can completely be discarded. This cotter pin keeps the main retainer nut from spinning and coming loose or coming off. Also can be discarded. I'm using an 1 1/8" socket. That should relieve the outer drum. Come off of there. Notice there is an inner bearing in that drum, and then the outer bearing also in the drum. You don't need those. New parts come with the kit, but what you'll put on with the rotor has that same type of an assembly. This unit is held on by 4 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a 9/16 nut on the back side of this. This stud, if you're lucky, will stay in place without turning. Just by virtue of its shape, it should hold. So we need a 9/16. Three of those are the same. The fourth one is a little longer, just because of the shape of the spindle that it mounts onto. Those can be discarded. The dirt could be caked on here pretty thick. It takes a little extra sometimes to get your socket to go over the nut. That stud turned through on me, so I'm going to grab it with these vice grips to keep it from turning. That's the long one. Discard. Now you do have a brake line. The hydraulic line goes from frame mounted off of this little 1/4" brake line into the drum. This is the side that you really want because we're not going to reuse this rubber hose. The kit comes with a new steel braided hose. Getting that off of there can be painful. We'll see how this goes. This brake line comes off the back of the drum and goes up to that joint where it then hits the 1/4" steel or copper, whatever that is, probably steel brake line. That bracket is mounted to the frame right there. My plan is to take out that bolt, pull the bracket away from the frame. I do have to be careful. I don't want to bend the metal line excessively, but enough that I can hopefully detach this here and get a clean rebuild when it's time to put that back together. That is disconnected. The bracket came with it. That's okay. It's much easier to relieve this. I do want to reuse this bracket, but it's easier to get this off over at the bench. So with that, we can pull that thing apart. We go ahead and pull this line off of the old drum brake. Make sure to leave a good brake fluid mess. The joint is actually replaced. A new one comes in a kit. And there you have it. That will just slip out of there. That can be discarded. This we will reuse. Don't need the end clip either. It comes with a new one of those. All of the dirt and grime around the control arms isn't such a big deal. We do want the spindle, though, to be good and clean. Mostly where the bearings ride, but also where the conversion plate sits here. We want to make sure that there are no major obstructions that would prevent it from sitting flat against the spindle. And you hit it now just quickly with some parts cleaner. Another good wipe. If you read through the instructions at this point, it will tell you which of these holes gets used in different scenarios based on whether you have a drum brake spindle or a disc brake spindle. The disc brake spindle is shaped a little more like a triangle with 3 mount points. If you have that one, this is a little more involved than what I have to deal with here. You'll need this. It sets on just like that, and it is bolted on with these bolts right here. There are 4 of them, and just like the studs that we took out, one of them is slightly longer than the other 3. Frankly, I was a little bit surprised to find that the caliper would sit up here on the forward side of the rotation. Most of them, I feel like, have the caliper more here toward the rear side of the rotation. I don't know if that matters, but that's what it says to do, so I'm just following the directions. Now we need to torque these to 30 foot-pounds. Now we need to pack the bearings with some high temperature disc brake wheel bearing grease. Big bearing is in. I've packed that with the grease and then placed the seal over the top of that to retain it. That required a rubber hammer and a block of wood, just the right size, to press the seal in all at the same time. This is a potential gotcha moment. Although not visible from this side of the rotor, notice on this side of the rotor there is a distinct arrow right there indicating the direction of rotation. This is the right side rotor and should not be placed on the left side of the car. So make sure you grab the right rotor when you put it all together. This now can be slid onto the spindle like so. Kit comes with a new washer, a new spindle nut, a new retainer. It also comes with a new cotter pin and a new cap. To tighten this up pretty good, this is probably, I don't know, that's probably about 30 foot-pounds right there. I'm going to back that off just a little bit and then grab it. Make sure it spins freely. No binding. That feels good to me. I like it. All that thing does is keep the nut from turning, since you really can't tighten it that much, right? It'll freeze a bearing if you over tighten it. You got to have something to keep an otherwise less than fully tightened nut from spinning on the spindle. Dust cap can go on the end, just like that. Inevitably it'll go on crooked, and you'll have to do something to convince it to straighten up. Something like that usually works pretty well. Voila. Rotor is done. Mounted to the spindle. We're spinning freely. Torque on the bearing feels good. There's no looseness in the rotor, and yet it spins freely. And we have the correct rotor on the passenger side of the car. Now, slightly different than what the instructions indicate. I like to put this fitting on the caliper before mounting the caliper, only because the accessibility after it's mounted is not great. You can do it, you can reach in there, but it's so much easier with it off. And for this fitting, it's a little different than a typical brake fitting. There's no compression on the inside, so we do want just a little bit of tape on the threads. Now we can thread that into the hydraulic feed point on the caliper, and then grab our 7/16 wrench and put it in there. Our goal is to have the caliper centered over the rotor. There are some spacers included with the kit to help do that. That thing is so close. Boy, if I were to space it, I don't know which way I'd do it. The instructions call for 3 washers as a starting point. I'm going to put none in. A little bit of thread lock is recommended on the caliper bolts. It calls for red. I'm out of red, so I'll use blue. Those get torqued to 40 foot-pounds. Now we can slide the brake pads in, and all we have left is to hook up the hydraulics. You gotta love these brakes, if nothing else, because swapping out the brake pads is about a 30-second operation. No more removing the entire caliper, letting it hang from the hydraulic line, and risking breaking it every time you put new pads on. All you gotta do is pull the pin, pull the pads, slip new pads in it, and reinsert the pin, and you're done. No drag, clean as a whistle. Okay, hydraulic line. The kit comes with 2 of the Union, and what you have to do is make sure that you get the right one. They are very slightly different sizes. I'm guessing 7/16 and 3/8. You have to get the one that fits whatever your metal brake line has on it. For me, it's the slightly larger of the 2. The bracket that we removed from the side of the frame will get utilized. It sits right there like that, and the little clip comes with the kit. It goes on there to hold it all together. It is tight. Just a little tap of the hammer puts that on there pretty easy. And there you have it. We'll put this on while it's easily accessible. Need the 11/16 to hold the big end, and then a 7/16 to tighten up the braided steel flex line. Start by feeding the supply line and the other little retainer clip. Click. And now the steel braided flexible line to the nipple needs to be good and tight. That line at the moment is not interfering on anything or rubbing with anything. I'll watch that after everything gets assembled. You don't want this line rubbing on the A-arms or on any of the pieces down here. Eventually it'll wear through, so make sure you route that in a way that it doesn't wear out. Those brakes need to be bled, but the installation is complete, and I'm pretty excited about that. Gotta love the disc brakes. I did buy some relatively small rotors. This will supposedly fit a 14-inch wheel, which is stock for this car. So if somebody ever wanted to go back to the old original wheel sizes, then these disc brakes would at least theoretically allow that. And for what I'm doing, they're big enough. Look, if you're doing some heavy-duty racing and you really need some whoa power, put the bigger ones on it. For this, I think that'll be just fine. They look sharp. I paid a little extra for the red paint on the caliper. Hopefully that's worth it, because the red makes it brake faster, right? And that, how do they say, is that.